The day my father-in-law stood up at the Thanksgiving table and said my family was too common to deserve a place in his daughter's life, I didn't say a single word. I just smiled, folded my napkin, and started planning. The man at the head of the table. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I grew up in a town so small it didn't have a traffic light until I was 12 years old. I'm not ashamed of that. I never was. Growing up in Cloverfield, Kentucky, meant you learned early that the measure of a man wasn't the thread count of his shirt or the neighborhood his mailbox sat in. It was whether he showed up when someone needed him, whether he kept his word, whether he could look his kids in the eye at the end of the day and honestly say he'd done right by them. My father, Harold Mercer, a mechanic who smelled permanently of motor oil and Old Spice, taught me that. My mother, Ruth, who worked the early shift at a diner for 31 years and never once complained about it, showed me that dignity wasn't something other people granted you. It was something you carried. So when I met Catherine Whitmore at a community college night class, she was getting her business certificate. I was finishing my accounting degree between shifts at a loading dock. I wasn't intimidated by the fact that she came from money. Old money, as it turned out. The kind that had a hyphenated family name behind it and a summer house that was referred to as the lake property, never just the cabin. Catherine wasn't like that, though. She was warm. She laughed at herself. She ate gas station hot dogs without irony and thought the best date we ever had was the night we got caught in a rainstorm at an outdoor concert and danced in the mud until our shoes were ruined. I fell in love with her because she was real in a world that kept trying to make her something else. What I didn't fully understand, in those early years of falling in love and building something together, was exactly how hard her world was going to push back. Her father's name was Richard Whitmore III. That the third should have been my first warning. Richard Whitmore III was a 64-year-old man who had never, as far as I could determine, done a genuinely difficult thing in his life. He had inherited a commercial real estate portfolio from his own father, expanded it moderately through the work of competent employees, and spent the better part of 3 decades believing that wealth was a sign of character rather than circumstance. He was tall, silver-haired, and possessed of a handshake that managed to communicate both formality and dismissal simultaneously. He wore quarter-zip sweaters that cost more than my first car. From the very first time Catherine brought me home, I was 26, she was 24. We'd been dating 8 months. Richard made his assessment of me and filed it away permanently. I saw it in his eyes at that first dinner. The small, almost imperceptible tightening around the corners of his mouth when Catherine mentioned where I'd grown up. The way he asked about my plans. The word carrying the implication that whatever I currently was doing couldn't possibly count as an actual plan. The way he spoke to me slowly, clearly, as one might address someone who required extra assistance understanding basic concepts. I told Catherine about it on the drive home. She squeezed my hand and said, "He's just protective. He'll come around." He did not come around. 12 years of toleration. We got married 2 years later, in a ceremony that Richard paid for partially and controlled entirely. He moved the venue from the charming barn Catherine had originally wanted to a hotel ballroom he had connections with. He invited 43 people she had never met. He gave a toast that was ostensibly about his daughter, but was actually, between the lines, about his family's legacy, and everything Catherine stood to inherit if she made good decisions going forward. I smiled through all of it because I loved Catherine, and because I was young enough to believe that proving myself through results would eventually change the old man's mind. In the 12 years that followed, I did exactly that, built results, that is. I got my CPA certification. Then I went back to school at night while Catherine and I raised our first son, Owen, and got my MBA. I started at a regional accounting firm, worked until I made partner, then left to co-found my own financial consulting firm with my college friend Marcus Webb. We started with 3 clients and a shared office space the size of a generous closet. By the time our second son, James, was born, we had 22 clients. By the time James started kindergarten, we had a staff of 14 and offices in 2 cities. We bought a house. A good house, not a mansion, but a solid 4-bedroom colonial with a real backyard and a neighborhood where the kids could ride bikes. I coached Owen's little league team. I helped James with his science fair project every year, even when it meant staying up until midnight building a working model of a water filtration system out of PVC pipe and gravel. Catherine and I had date nights. We argued sometimes and made up well. We were, by any honest accounting, a genuinely happy family. And through all of it, Richard Whitmore III remained unconvinced. He wasn't cruel about it exactly. He was too refined for cruelty. Instead, he operated through 1,000 small gestures of dismissal. He would ask about my business and then immediately pivot to telling a story about someone he knew who really understood the financial sector. He would compliment our house in a tone that made it clear he considered it charmingly modest. When Owen showed an aptitude for baseball, Richard said it was a nice hobby for a boy like him. A phrase I turned over in my mind for weeks afterward, trying to understand exactly how much condescension could be packed into 6 words. He had a phrase he used sometimes when he thought I wasn't listening, or perhaps when he didn't particularly care if I was. He'd say that Catherine's side of the family, meaning his side, meaning the Whitmore side, was well-bred. He never said my side was poorly bred. He simply never included us in that category, which amounted to the same thing. My parents, Harold and Ruth Mercer, who drove 11 hours to attend every one of their grandchildren's birthdays, who sent handwritten cards for every holiday, who showed up to help us move twice without being asked and refused to take a dime for it. Richard referred to them as Catherine's in-laws, even after a decade, as though their existence in relation to his family was purely administrative. My mother pretended not to notice. My father noticed and said nothing, because Harold Mercer was a man who understood that some battles weren't worth the cost. I told myself the same thing for 12 years. Thanksgiving. The breaking point came on a Thursday in November, as breaking points so often do in American families. Owen was 11. James was 7. We had driven 3 hours to Richard's house, a 10,000-square-foot estate in Connecticut that he referred to, without apparent self-awareness, as the home place for Thanksgiving, as we did every year. Catherine's mother, Eleanor, had passed away 4 years earlier, and since then the holiday gatherings had taken on a slightly more mournful and considerably more rigid quality, as though Richard was compensating for her absence by making the occasion more formal. There were 14 people at the table that year: Catherine's brother William and his wife Simone, William and Simone's 3 children who attended private school and had been trained from birth to hold a fork correctly, Richard's sister, Aunt Patricia, who was pleasant in a brittle way, a couple Richard described as old family friends, the Hargroves, who appeared to own something, boats, possibly, or horses, or both, and us. The meal itself went fine. The food was catered, which Richard always arranged because he considered himself too important to cook, and Catherine's cooking, while excellent, was apparently insufficiently formal for the occasion. Owen and James behaved beautifully. James knocked over his water glass because James was 7 and water glasses are their natural enemy, but he apologized sweetly, and I helped clean it up, and it was the kind of small, human moment that makes family dinners real. Richard's expression at the spilled water was the same expression he might have worn watching someone clip their toenails at the table. After dessert, when the plates had been cleared and the adults were sitting with coffee and wine, Richard cleared his throat. He had something to say. Richard always cleared his throat before he said things, a habit that had long since come to fill me with low-grade dread. "I've been doing some thinking," he began, "about the family." I assumed this meant some announcement about the estate or perhaps the lake property. There had been discussions about whether to sell it. But Richard wasn't looking at documents. He was looking at the table in the manner of a man about to deliver a verdict. I've spoken with William, he continued, glancing at Catherine's brother who had the grace, barely, to look slightly uncomfortable. And with Patricia, and we've all come to a conclusion as a family. Catherine had gone very still beside me. I could feel it. There are certain standards, Richard said, that this family has always maintained. Standards of conduct, of presentation, of, he paused, seemingly searching for the precise word, refinement. And it's become clear to me over the years that not every addition to this family has been well suited to upholding those standards. The table had gone very quiet. Even the Hargroves, who barely knew any of us, seemed to have stopped breathing. Dad, Catherine began. I'm not trying to be unkind, Richard said, and the most terrifying thing was that he genuinely believed this. I'm trying to be honest. Daniel is a perfectly decent man. But this family, the Whitmore family, has a reputation, a legacy, a place in this community. And the Mercer side of things simply doesn't. He made a vague gesture with his hand, a gesture that somehow managed to encompass my parents, my hometown, my profession, my children's baseball games and science fair projects and knocked-over water glasses, and dismiss them all. It simply doesn't fit. I think it would be best, going forward, if major family occasions, holidays, the lake property, the formal gatherings, were kept to immediate Whitmore family. He meant, you are not invited anymore. He meant, you have been voted out. He had discussed this with his son and his sister, formed a consensus, and was now delivering the ruling from on high at the Thanksgiving table in front of my 7-year-old, as though this were a board meeting and we were an underperforming quarter. The silence lasted 4 seconds. I know because I counted, because I needed something to do with my mind while my body processed what had just been said. Then Owen, my 11-year-old son, looked across the table at his grandfather with the clear, uncomplicated gaze of a child who had not yet learned to wrap anger in politeness, and said, "You're saying we're not good enough." Richard opened his mouth, closed it. "Owen," I said. "No," Owen said, and his voice was remarkably steady. "I want to know. Because my grandpa Harold helps coach my baseball team, and my grandma Ruth taught me to make her biscuit recipe, and Dad built James's whole science fair project with him and they won 2nd place, and we show up for things and we're a good family. So I want to know what you mean by refined, because it sounds like you just mean rich." The table remained silent. William stared at the tablecloth. Simone appeared to be examining the middle distance. Aunt Patricia made a small sound. Richard said stiffly, "Children don't speak to adults that way in this family." "Maybe that's the problem," Owen said quietly, and then he looked at me. And I looked at my son, this 11-year-old boy who had just done something braver than I had managed in 12 years, and I made a decision. I stood up, calmly. I set my napkin on the table. I looked at Catherine, who had tears running silently down her face, and I said very gently, "We're going to head home, sweetheart, whenever you're ready." Then I looked at Richard, and I smiled. "Thank you for dinner, Richard," I said. "We'll be in touch." I got the boys' coats. I went to the car. I did not slam a single door. The planning. Catherine came out 20 minutes later. She had said things to her father that she told me about in pieces over the following weeks, and I'll honor the privacy of that conversation except to say that whatever she said, she meant it, and it cost her something, and she said it anyway. That told me everything I needed to know about who I had married. On the drive home, James fell asleep in his car seat. Owen sat quietly for the first hour and then said, "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm better than okay," I told him. "What are you going to do?" I looked at him in the rearview mirror. "I'm going to show your grandfather exactly what the Mercer family is." Owen nodded slowly, satisfied with this answer. He fell asleep 20 minutes later. I drove the rest of the way home in the dark, and I thought, here's the thing about being underestimated your entire adult life. It teaches you patience. It teaches you to work quietly and build steadily, and let the results speak when the time is right. Richard had spent 12 years looking at me and seeing a mechanic's son from Kentucky who had gotten lucky marrying above his station. He'd never once looked closely enough to understand what I had actually built, what I was capable of, or who the people standing behind me were. That was his mistake, and I was going to let him make it just a little while longer. My plan wasn't about revenge. I want to be clear about that because what I did could be mistaken for revenge if you look at it too quickly. But revenge is reactive, emotional, meant to wound. What I was planning was more like a demonstration. A very thorough, very calm, very comprehensive demonstration of exactly what refinement actually looks like when you strip away the inherited money and the expensive sweaters and look at what's underneath. I made 3 calls in the following week. The first was to Marcus, my business partner, to let him know what had happened and to discuss timing on something we'd been considering for a while. The second was to my parents. The third was to a journalist named Patrick Acaffer, who wrote a long-form business column for a regional magazine that, as it happened, was very popular among the Connecticut commercial real estate community. Exactly the community in which Richard Whitmore III maintained his precious reputation. Over the next 8 months, several things happened. Marcus and I closed the deal we'd been discussing, which was the acquisition of a smaller consulting firm in Boston that gave us an expanded client base, and suddenly, a genuinely significant profile in New England financial circles. The announcement ran in 3 business publications. I was quoted in all 3. We had a small celebration in our office with our staff, ate mediocre grocery store cake, and it was the best party I had attended in years. Patrick Acaffer, who was a genuinely excellent journalist and who had been wanting to write about our firm's growth model for some time, published a long profile piece in the magazine. The headline was something like "The Quiet Giants: How Mercer Webb Consulting Built a New England Presence One Relationship at a Time." It ran 4,000 words. There was a photograph of Marcus and me in our office, looking, if I may say, extremely competent and not at all unrefined. The piece circulated widely in exactly the business circles where Richard Whitmore maintained his social standing. 3 of his associates emailed him links to it. I know this because one of them was the husband of a woman in Catherine's former book club, and word travels. My parents, Harold and Ruth Mercer, came up to visit that spring. We took them to a nice dinner, not ostentatious, just genuinely good food at a restaurant with real cloth napkins, and I told them what Richard had said at Thanksgiving. My mother's face went through about 7 expressions in 4 seconds. My father just nodded slowly, the way he did when something confirmed a thing he'd already understood. "He's a frightened man," my father said. "People who need other people to be lesser than them are always frightened of something." "I know, Dad." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to invite him to Owen's award ceremony." My father's mouth curved slowly. "That right?" Owen, as it happened, had been selected for a statewide Young Leaders Recognition Program, an honor given to 12 students in his grade across the entire state, based on academic excellence, community involvement, and character references from teachers and community members. He had done this entirely on his own, with no input from me beyond helping him fill out the application form correctly. When the letter arrived, Catherine cried. I cried. James informed us both that crying was embarrassing, and then cried himself 5 minutes later when we explained what it meant. The ceremony was at the state capitol building. It was, by any measure, a formal occasion. I wore a suit. Catherine wore a dress that made her look like she could have walked off the page of a magazine. James wore a clip-on tie that he picked out himself and was incredibly proud of. My parents drove up, and my father wore a blazer I had never seen before, and my mother wore a brooch that had belonged to her own mother. We sent Richard an invitation. Formal, printed, mailed in an envelope. No commentary, just the details of the event and the information that his grandson was being honored. He came, I'll give him that. He came with William, who had quietly apologized to Catherine months earlier in a phone call that I understand was somewhat painful and somewhat genuine. Richard stood in the rotunda of the state capitol in his quarter-zip sweater, slightly underdressed, as it happened, for the formality of the occasion, and watched his grandson receive a commendation from a state legislator and give a short speech about community and character that made everyone in the room tear up, including, unless I was very much mistaken, Richard himself. Afterward in the lobby, Richard found me. I waited. He looked at me for a long moment. He looked at Owen, who was shaking hands with a state official with the ease and confidence of someone raised to know that his worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions of his family. Richard Whitmore, I said quietly. He's a fine boy. He is, I said. He gets that from somewhere. I said nothing, because sometimes silence is the most complete sentence. Richard looked at the floor for a moment, then he looked back at me. Daniel, he stopped. The things I said at Thanksgiving were not. Another stop. Richard Whitmore, who had never in his life struggled to project authority and certainty, was struggling. We're not your finest moment, I offered. He nodded stiffly, painfully, but he nodded. What refinement actually means. Here is what I know about refinement, having spent 43 years on this earth, 12 of them being judged as lacking it. Refinement is not about where you were born or what your father did for work. It is not about whether your thank you notes are handwritten on monogrammed stationery or whether you know which fork is for salad. It is not about the neighborhood your house is in, the school your children attend, or whether your family has a hyphenated name with a number behind it. Refinement, the real kind, is what Owen showed at that Thanksgiving table when he spoke truth to power at age 11 without cruelty and without flinching. It's what my mother showed for 31 years of early diner shifts, greeting every single customer like they mattered, because in her view they did. It's what my father showed in never once stooping to bitterness about a world that had given him hard hands and modest means, because Harold Mercer knew who he was, and that knowledge was impervious to other people's opinions. It's what Catherine showed when she walked out of that Thanksgiving dinner and spoke to her father honestly, at personal cost, because integrity mattered more to her than comfort. Real refinement is the capacity to treat people as fully human regardless of their usefulness to you. It is the willingness to tell the truth even when the truth is unwelcome. It is showing up for baseball games and science fairs and moving days and 11-hour drives without being asked and without keeping score. It is the knowledge that dignity is not inherited. It is built daily in the choices you make about how to treat the people around you. Richard Whitmore had the trappings of refinement and had confused them for the thing itself for so long that he had genuinely lost the ability to tell the difference. And I felt, standing in the lobby of the state capitol watching him look at his grandson with something approaching awe, something that surprised me. I felt sorry for him. Not contempt, not satisfaction. Sorrow, genuine and simple, for a man who had spent 64 years accumulating the symbols of a good life and had missed, somewhere along the way, the actual thing. Things did not transform overnight. Richard is not a man who makes dramatic gestures of change, but change, the real kind, rarely announces itself dramatically anyway. He called Owen on his birthday that year. A real call, not a card. He asked Owen about school, about baseball, about his friends. Owen told me afterward that it was a pretty normal grandfather conversation, which I considered a significant upgrade. He came to James's next science fair. James had built a working model of a solar panel array this time, and he explained it to his grandfather with the thorough, slightly breathless enthusiasm of an 8-year-old who has been thinking about solar power for 3 months straight. Richard listened, actually listened, asking questions that showed he was following along. James beamed. "He's pretty smart," Richard told me afterward, with something in his voice that might, if you were feeling generous, be called pride. "He is," I said. "He gets it from somewhere." The corner of Richard's mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. My parents came for Christmas that year. It was the first time we'd had everyone under the same roof: Richard, William and his family, my parents, all of us. I was tense about it in the weeks leading up, mapping out in my mind all the ways it could go sideways. Catherine held my hand the night before and said, "Whatever happens, we'll be okay." What happened was, my father and Richard sat together in the living room after dinner, and somehow, through channels I still don't fully understand, they got talking about engines. Richard had an old car he was restoring, a hobby he'd taken up since Alina passed, something to do with his hands, and my father, who has forgotten more about engines than most people ever learn, started asking questions, then answering them, then drawing a diagram on a napkin. By the time the rest of us were doing dishes, Harold Mercer and Richard Whitmore were sitting knee to knee. My father's motor oil-worn hands and Richard's carefully maintained ones both gesturing at the same napkin, talking about carburetors. Catherine came and stood next to me in the doorway, and we watched them for a moment. "I'll be damned," I said. She leaned her head against my shoulder. "What I did. People sometimes ask me when I tell this story what exactly I did. What was my grand move? What was the play? And the honest answer, which often disappoints people who want something more dramatic, is this: I kept going. I kept building the business. I kept coaching Little League. I kept helping with science fair projects. I kept being the person I had always been because I had never needed Richard Whitmore's validation to know my own worth. I just kept going, clearly and consistently, and I let the record speak for itself. I didn't shout. I didn't make speeches. I didn't try to beat Richard at his own game by accumulating the symbols he valued. I just continued being, as thoroughly and unapologetically as possible, exactly who the Mercer family was. And when the moment came, when Owen stood up at 11 years old and asked his grandfather what refined actually meant, with that clear, direct, unafraid gaze, I realized I hadn't needed a plan at all. The work had already been done. Every baseball practice, every science fair, every birthday card my mother mailed, every lesson my father had ever taught me about showing up, all of it had produced that boy, standing calmly at that table, asking the question that no adult had been willing to ask. The best thing I ever did, it turns out, was simply raise my sons to know who they are. The second best thing I did was smile, fold my napkin, and let Richard Whitmore eventually discover it for himself. Some lessons can't be taught, they can only be witnessed. And occasionally, if you're patient enough, even a man like Richard will finally, slowly, start to see. Daniel Mercer lives in New England with his wife Catherine and their 2 sons. He still coaches Little League. His mother's biscuit recipe is still the best thing he has ever eaten, and he has no intention of ever admitting otherwise in print.